I'm here with Bill. Hey, Bill. So, yep, Bill has proceeded to achieve one more orbit around the sun.
Yep.
So, he's going to hang with us today, which is cool because Pepper, that's Pepper back there. Pepper, whoa, I'm trying to do it. Pepper is working. So, which is cool. So, we're going to discuss all the things that go with Bellatrix Rising. And that's like apparently what we wanted to do today. We were going to do painting, but my painting area is covered now with used tablets. So we're
And
having
Bill's a super fan of Bellatrix.
Bill's a super fan of Bellatrix Rising. I have to remember next time I'm down there to give you a copy of the first comic thingy, the world building document. It has deck plans.
We bought it at the last.
Oh, that's right, you did.
Yep.
Never mind.
Kimusabi.
I don't remember these things anymore. It's all becoming a blur. Everything's becoming a blur.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Guy, he won't let me touch it.
He won't let you touch it. Okay.
My desk. That's not true.
And I tried to pick it up, and he's like, "That's mine."
That's funny. So, okay, Bill, what do we talk about? We talk about like.
No, I was talking with Craig the other day. It could be in your universe, or it could be in this universe. Really, if we were to ever come up with holograms that can have physical forms, in other words, they can manipulate their environment.
Yep.
I don't know.
These guys do. These guys can.
So they can manipulate the environment around them. And I know we talked about how the AIs that don't quite form right, they might become lesser AIs.
They're like ghosts. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they don't have all the programming.
I imagined, even in this, especially in this universe, not necessarily Bellatrix Rising's universe, if we had that, what I could see happening is that we would pair those up with people at birth, and they would be like a living companion, and they would help raise you, educate you, they would protect you. And I could see in a spacefaring race, like one would travel with you down to a planet, and since they can take any form, they're a digital being, and they can interact, they could literally form a suit around you. If you were harmed, they could literally hold your insides in, so to speak. Or if your heart was damaged, they could form part of your heart and pump for you until you got.
Yeah, they would make an awesome doctor, wouldn't they? That'd be cool.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was actually explored once in Voyager, right?
Okay.
Because remember the episode? Well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. Where the Vidian stole Neelix's lungs, and so the doctor put holographic lungs in there to breathe for him.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we're talking about Hycils. We were coming up with another name for them because we figured that calling them artificial intelligences would be kind of like using the N-word. They would get to the point where they're like, no, we don't want to be called that anymore.
I'm an intelligence, not an artificial.
Right, we're an intelligence. We're not artificial. There's nothing artificial about us. You know what I mean? Like, so AIs would become a point where like, we don't want to be called that. So we were having that discussion. So Brent has come up with holographic silicon life forms, Hycils. And I thought that was a kind of a cool terminology too. You know, because synthetic would have the same problem.
Right.
I mean, it would be like, we're not synthetic. We're not, you know, that sounds artificial again. Like we're not real.
They're just a silicon life form.
Silicon life form. Yeah. We could call them sillies. Oh yeah, that'll go over well.
Right.
You guys are sillies. Okay, wait, no.
They're silicates.
Right. Silicates. Oh, silicates. I like silicates too. That's a good one. Because that one's cool.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, like if you have the ability to manipulate and, you know, we using force fields. Here we go. 15 espresso shots to deal with diplomatic. I like that one. So my buddy Booma has been making more general orders because there's a scene in the comic now where my captain is drinking her coffee and somebody comes up and says, Captain, blah, 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 blah. And she's like, stop. General Order 21, nothing more than 2 syllables before coffee o'clock or whatever.
Mhm.
And so she makes, so Booma has been going on and just making more and more general orders that are all like in the same vein, which is awesome because I'm just recording them because they're great. It's like somewhere I can just see this happening. But yeah, I like the idea of silicate. I'm going to write that one down too.
I'll be right back. I need to blow my nose.
Okay, go do that. Hysil is good. Silicate is good. I like both of them as far as names. So we're going to use or silicate. Because silicate, I don't think has ever been used either. So silicate sounds really awesome, actually. In fact, I hate to say this, Brent, but I'm liking silicate kind of more than I like Hysil. Mostly because they're not necessarily always holographic. I mean, they are holographic, but that's not the essence of them. I feel kind of like that's still kind of like calling us meat bags. Because, yeah, I mean, though that is true, it's not really our essence. But of course, then calling them silicates would be like calling us carbonates. You know what I mean? Like on that same token. I mean, realistically, what they would have is they'd have a name called, Boogity Boggity. And you'd be like, where in the world did that come from? You know, and it'd be, because I mean, human doesn't make any sense either. Like, where does human come from? That does not describe any part of us in any way.
The comedian in my head hears them saying their name, and it just sounds like the 1990s dial-up modem sound.
Right. Right. What's your name?
But in your language, it's Bob.
Right. Exactly. Oh man. So somebody had said on Reddit that there was something posted, and I was talking about this last night. They were talking about 07, and it's an emoji for a salute, which makes sense. You got a 0 and a 7, it's a salute. And this person was like, wow, I've been on the internet since the boop screech days, and I've never seen that. And I was like, boop screech. Yeah, that's probably the most apt way of explaining the era of the internet that we're all from. Boop screech. I love that name. So I'm going to pilfer that at some time. Anyway, so yeah, that I think silicate. I like silicate. And then maybe Hysil is also another name that they go by. I mean, because like we go by humans, we go by people, we go by. I mean, there's a number of different types of terms. Silicake doesn't sound good.
I bet everywhere you go with the AIs that they have their own dialects, because going from engineering job to engineering job to engineering job, every job has their own local dialect of emojis and text symbols and things like that you have to kind of get used to.
Yeah.
I find it funny we're in an age where like there are so localities to like expression and language that is from job to job, it's different. So I imagine the same thing will be for them, where all their shorthands are different depending on where they're from.
And there's a lot of interesting things that I've been kind of contemplating on this one. Like Brian went through and edited sort of the first 16 pages. I printed them out so that I could take them with me to the drawing club last night. And I mean, this is just the roughs. So, I mean, literally they're horribly rough. Right. And then the reality is they're on my page here, which is a 8.5 by 11 at 600 DPI, and all 32 pages are on it. So they're very small. and I just blew them up to big size so I could write words all over it. And Brian went through and did some edits on it, and I was noticing that I have a very definitive vision of what this world is like. Because he was like, "Oh, I think you should do X, Y, or Z," and I'm like, "That's not going to work." And I mean, like I could feel, and it's interesting that that's where I have evolved to with this story. There's a feel to things. Like you were just talking about them talking in emojis, and I was like, "They won't." And I was like, "But why?" Asking myself, why? Why do you say that? Why? What's the? And it's because they fought so hard to be equals that they're going to work extra hard to talk slow, to talk in the exact same method of Tamerbeshi with everybody. I mean, they will have engineering slang, but it's all going to be the same engineering slang that everybody else in engineering would have. And they would want to, they'd intentionally try not to stand out by, boop screeching each other.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think Silipix.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, because Booma hasn't been here for that discussion. So Booma, in this world, in the comic that I'm writing, the AIs are equals. They fought for the right. They had a war. They had to become equals about 200 years prior to this comic. And one of the things that happens now is only AIs can make new AIs, and sometimes they come out damaged, just like anything. There's a reading error, there's a writing error, or whatever. And instead of deleting that being and creating a new one, they let the being live, and we get disabled AIs. And sometimes they become certain aspects of the culture we've been discussing, like maybe they become cats or dogs or something like that, pets for people. But then that became this really gray moral zone, which I actually was like, kind of like that. Like, we should explore that and say, are you sure this is a good idea? Like have the internal characters sort of mull that over. We've turned all the disabled people into pets, and you're kind of like, wait a minute, have you thought this through? Which would be kind of a cool story in and of itself. But what Bill was talking about was the idea of them maybe not being corporeal. Like that was the error in the code. They can't form the hardened areas, so they can't touch you. They cannot actually like do that. So they're non-corporeal holograms or something. And I think that would also be kind of cool because it's a disability, but it's not the disability that would impact their ability to do a job. It just would impact their ability to have any kind of tactile relationship with anything. Yep. You want poor Brent he gets, I finally get my dragon AI. And everybody's like, look, Brent, we don't do that anymore. We don't treat disabled AIs that way. Brent's like, but my dragon.
Well, in my mind, it was you're bonded at birth, right? So this is your life companion.
Yeah, I like the life companion part too. I think that's also cool. I think that one of the things that I think is also a big deal in my culture is that disabilities are handled by the community. So you're not ostracized. Cat's just lurking. You're not ostracized. You're taken care of. We take care of you. If you're so we use your abilities. You become still a useful member of society, and we help manage your disabilities. I'm thinking of this because I've got a buddy who's got multiple sclerosis, and she has been slowly getting shakier and shakier. And our group just is starting to kind of form like a barrier around her to keep her from hurting herself. Like the other night she was cutting apples, and and I'm like, whoa, you want me to cut the apple? But she still wants her independence.
Right.
I get that, but please don't cut your finger off while you're doing it.
So here's a weird off the wall thought
from my end. When you visit the AI homeworld, like their planet, before they land, the other AIs, thank you, Brent. The other AIs on the ship basically go, by the way, most of the people here will not make an effort to make you understand them. Be prepared for screech boop.
Right. Well, and that is sort of the question. And it's hard because, of course, the culture that I come from never was, put down. So it's kind of hard to kind of, from my point of view, see out. But, you talk about like colonizers and colonizing different cultures, like the Native American cultures and stuff like that. They still retain their native languages.
Mm-hmm.
So you're probably right. There probably would be a boop screech.
Yep. The binars. They talk
binars.
with you, and then with each other, they're just going at it,
Right. Here we all are talking about little teeny under. You're right. There would definitely be a boop screech.
Mm-hmm. I could imagine a scene where like someone's telling a story about how they were there, and then they offended them, and all of a sudden you just hear like they just heard this ominous, like screech. They're just all screeching. It was the scariest moment in my life.
Right. Exactly. Well, and actually, now that I mentioned that, it probably would be like having a native language, or a second language. Yeah. There are a couple of phrases that I use in Japanese because there's just really isn't a phrase that's appropriate for the feeling in English. Natsukashi is a great one. That's a Japanese feeling of nostalgia, but nostalgia in English has a negative connotation, like, oh, I'm nostalgic for the days when I was young and whatever. Whereas Natsukashi has more of a feeling of, isn't that a pleasant feeling? Like, ooh, don't you love spring? The feeling at spring is so nostalgic. It's like a weird positive feel. And so I feel like the word is different. I like to use betsu betsu as well, which is separate, like discrete. Because the word it literally means discreet, but the way we use discreet in English has changed to mean I don't talk to you about this, or we don't discuss this in public, and so it doesn't have the same meaning anymore. It's sort of switched. So betsu betsu sounds better because it's like, oh, I like to keep like my peas and carrots betsu betsu. You just like to keep them separated so that they don't mix, or I like to keep my vegetables betsu betsu from my mashed potatoes.
What's wrong with mixing your peas, huh?
I was just thinking of what I had. And by the way, for those who I do dine with regularly, I actually do not have that problem. It's just the first thought process I came up with. Good morning or good evening, Hone. It's good to see you here. Honto. Yep. So, yeah, Lucia. Honto? What do you mean? You mean, oh, yeah, Honto? Yeah. So, Honto is an interesting Japanese term because the characters are origin and hit. I find that fascinating to me. Like, how did you get really out of origin and hit? So, yay, good job. Woo! Hone's joining us. That's also good. I'm glad to see Hone's better. So yeah, it's but it's the same thing. So I guess you're right. We would have boop screech, but it would be weird things where they don't have a word for it. It'd be kind of like, oh yeah, the other day we were eating this food, and I've got to tell you, it was very beep burp beep, and I just couldn't deal with it. And you're like, whoa, what was that?
Well, they might even have that because they might have a more advanced language where they have descriptors that we just don't have.
Well, that's what I mean. Like there would be, and if you think about Tamerbeshi, which is a conglomeration of all of the languages of Earth, mixed together in a big blender, and then somebody logically trying to take the best parts of the language and make it work so that it's easy to learn, kind of like Esperanto was, how we all invented Esperanto, and it was supposed to be an easier language that was supposed to be, that kind of thing. But the nature of the story, everybody is thrown together on one big spaceship and then thrown into a big dome, and then they had 100 years to get over it, whatever was going on. And so it would be logical that we'd be like, well, we could all sit here and speak Chinese and English and German and Japanese, or we could just stop and all make one language. And, well, what language should we all speak? Well, maybe not English because that's hard. And maybe not Japanese because that's hard. And maybe not Chinese because that's hard. How about we make a new language? So I'm sure that there are holes. Like there's no word for this. I actually I have a scene in my head because the auto translator is going to be auto translating from Tamarbeshi to English for Alex in this story, because she's an American from 2020, whatever, 2020X, she's an American from today. So she's speaking English and they're all speaking Tamarbeshi around her. And so I just had this wonderful thought of this scene where they're all saying the same word. And, well, you're saying pen. No, I'm not saying pen. I'm saying pen. Why would I say pen? That's a weird thing to say. Who would say pen? And it's like, but you just said pen again. No, I didn't. I said pen, because the auto translator keeps translating it back and forth.
Yeah.
And, so it's the same word to Alex, because in English it'd be the same word, but there's a finite difference between the two words that the auto translator won't do, or going the other direction into Tamarbeshi. So I think you're right. I think there would be a little bit of boop screech.
Well, I think even if they tried to resist that and say they try to keep everything in Tamarbeshi, it would be, they would run into that thing where I forget where I heard it, but when people who have greater intelligences speak, a lot of context gets dropped because they're going to infer it and they're intelligent enough to infer it.
Yeah.
And so if you have these, more intelligent silicates, they might drop a lot of context, and someone who's not in the conversation might be like, "What are they talking about?" Because there was this, there's this joke in like engineering, where like when you're in sync with your other engineering team, the conversation will be like, "Oh, it's that. Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. I think we should have done that." And it's like, you are like completely
There's no
lost.
words. Yeah.
They're in sync with what they're talking about, and if you're not in there, you're lost.
Well, yeah, and languages have that. Japanese, one of the things that native Japanese speakers are cognizant of, and I'm not sure if this is true of Chinese derivative languages, like all the languages coming from Chinese ultimately, or if it's just Japanese, because I haven't studied enough on the other languages yet, but but they drop the subject. So we would start with, Bill and I are going to the store. Drive the car.
Mhm.
And you're like, wait, whoa. Who's driving the car? Well,
Right.
Bill is. We started the whole thing with Bill.
They do that in French too.
Yeah. So,
They do it in a way where basically, like in the middle of the sentence, like if you have the same word in the sentence 2 times, they'll use a replacement that also means like at the, or it's like it doesn't make sense, but it's supposed to be that way.
Right.
It's super weird.
Right. Well, and it's hard because in Japanese, I will continue to repeat the subject, which sounds awkward in native speaking. It would be like, Bill and I are going to go to the store, and Bill and I are going, it's like, to them, it sounds like I'm just repeating Bill and I over and over and over. What's your problem, dude? So it's it's funny how that's a different thing. I've been called out a number of times by my Japanese friends. They're like, you don't have to keep repeating the subject. We know what you're talking about here. But it is right, exactly. So you have to wait. Kat's absolutely right. You conjugate only the last verb. All the rest of them are in basic form. So you don't conjugate any verbs except the last one. And so you have to wait. You have to be there for the beginning of the discussion, and you have to wait for the ending of the discussion. Because if you miss either one of those, you're screwed. Right? Or rue. They'll put them all in the dictionary form, the rue. Because they'll sit there and, nani, 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 te, nani, 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 te. And that's in current tense. And then they'll nani, nani, ta. And you're like, oh, okay, so all of this happened before. Gotcha. But everything was in present tense, right? Or when they'll put everything in root form or base form on the verbs. Bill and I go to the store, drive the car, and went yesterday. It's like, what? What? Doesn't even make sense. Anyway, I think that's all fascinating on that one too. I like silicate, by the way, as the name. I'm liking silicate. I'm tending towards silicate more than I'm tending towards high sil. Sorry, Brent.
So the Rick and Morty comedian in me is just imagining, because we're talking about AIs that didn't come out right, is someone, the two cell kits are there and they're in front of the machine that's creating the
baby.
child, baby, and they're just so hopeful, waiting, and then some human comes in drunk and just bumps into it, and you just hear this big scratch, like, oh god, I'm sure it's fine. It's fine.
I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure everything's okay.
They're just there like,
I'm sure everything's fine.
It took us 2 years to get this appointment.
Right. Well, and that's back to they won't kill that child, because we wouldn't. We wouldn't kill a child if the child was obviously unless the child was going to have a miserable life. And, but short of that, well, I guess we'll just put up with whatever's happening here. My kiddo has ADD. I guess we'll just deep breath, wipe the child out for that, And I guess there's levels of it. It gets to the point where he bumps the thing and it scratches the entire disc. It's like, well, yeah, that's not going well. This isn't going to end well. I don't think that's a viable operable creature. So you're like, not to see, I guess. So yeah, that's an interesting sort of thing. But yeah, it was also it was interesting because Brian was looking at a scene where Bennett and Chang are talking. Bennett's my first officer, Chang's the captain. And Bennett has been coming up with newer and differenter ways to speak to her captain, because the captain on small ships is referred to as a skipper, as opposed to a captain. On the larger ships, they're called captains. On the smaller ships, they're called skippers. So she's calling Chang Skippy, and Chang's like, no. And then she's like, skip? And no, it's like back and forth and back and forth and back and forth like this. And it's funny because Brian was like, you've got to make her more emphatic. And I'm like, I think Chang's blood is right now, she doesn't have enough blood in her coffee stream yet. So she's just like, no. She's not fighting anything. And it's interesting that I already have a feel for where this character is, but he didn't, because when he read the preview, there was no text, there was no dialogue in any of these scenes with Chang. So he was coming up with, I have no feel for Chang as a character. And then I went through while we were sitting there last night and I wrote in all the dialogue, And he reread it and he's like, okay, now I have a feel for the character. And I'm like, it's interesting. She's coming through on the dialogue, whereas the other characters are coming through by the action that's happening. You shouldn't wipe the kid, but no one's saying you can't. Well, I think that will end up being an interesting discussion at some point in time. An interesting way to discuss the abortion debate would be through the silicates, because then you'd have that same discussion topic, but you wouldn't have it directly. It wouldn't be about humans, But then there's the other discussion topics like genetic modification. It's frowned upon. And it's frowned upon because that's exactly what they did to Chang. And they've been modifying her people for about 150 or 200 years. Green Hollow restart. Oh gosh. But I mean, like, they've been genetically modifying her, and now she's very childlike, as far as appearance. She's a 35-year-old woman that looks like she's probably 15 or 16. And it was intentional. And because of that, there are kind of some real frowned upon DNA manipulation and altering of genes.
Often imagined in this universe, like if I was president and I had power, right? Or I could write the laws, that I feel like genetic manipulation will be a thing in the future, and that we should have a rule that no more than X% of the population can have any modifications, because you need a control group. You need a group that, like, when this goes wrong, they can repopulate.
Well, but there's also reasons to make genetic manipulation correct. There'd be good reasons for it. My stepmom has cerebral palsy.
Yeah. No, I'm not saying it shouldn't happen. I'm just saying.
Right. I'm just saying I think she would love to have lived a different life.
Yeah.
Where she wasn't on crutches and stuff like that. But then you're back to, okay, but if you can fix my stepmom from having, or for that matter, my buddy who's got multiple sclerosis, if you can kill that, why can't you change my eyes from blue to brown?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't you change my green eyes into yellow cat's one?
Exactly.
And then if I get tired of that, why can't I change it again?
Right. I mean, if it becomes that easy, why not? But then you have the question of, okay, but now you're infantizing your women, and and now you have a problem. Now you've passed it to, yeah, but what if they all want to look like that? Well, how do you make that decision? Where do you make that line? I have seen people do some bizarre stuff to their bodies.
Well, not only that, like if you have gene modification, and what about those lines about prisoners? So say you have someone who has a genetic predisposition that they just don't have a lot of ability to control themselves. They don't have willpower.
Or maybe empathy.
And so they're a serial rapist or something. Well, gene therapy might help them gain the ability to hold themselves.
Self-control over it.
Self-control. But is that something
you want it?
Their will?
Yeah. It'd have to be against their will, because they would think that they were doing fine. Right? And that would be back to the, wait a minute. Is it against their, right? Look like Jason Momoa. Jabba the Hutt and Chewie had a kid? I don't think so, Brent.
I would love the gene therapy that gave me a higher metabolism.
Right. Right. I mean, some of those things would be, I wouldn't mind a gene therapy that just restored my dopamine levels so that I wasn't constantly hunting out for weird dopamine hits, which I get through food. And that irritates the heck out of me, because I'd rather that not be a thing, which is bizarre when I'm on ADD meds that I'm not hungry. That's so weird. It's like such a strange chemical change. It's so weird.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I concur. It's where we'll have to explore the lines of this. What is your right as a human or a creature, a person in our society? What's your right to your randomness?
Hmm.
Because if you go too much, we would lose distinction, right? I mean, part of our distinction is our flaws.
Hmm.
It's kind of like when people talk about the mythos of the great aliens. Um, they are a cloned race. Very few of them can actually reproduce biologically.
Right?
So, because they have enhanced their bodies to the point of space travel so much that they started losing the ability to naturally reproduce.
In some conspiracy theory circles, they're actually us from the future, trying to figure out on how they can reproduce again because they did so much genetic manipulation. They're a dying race, and we're a dying race because we screwed our genetics up so much that we're
We
doomed.
can't reproduce.
That's why I would want a law that says, a certain percentage, just
Have to be control groups.
yeah.
I feel like that ship may have sailed quite a bit by
Yeah.
the time we get to Unity. In this aspect, because I feel like there have been mistakes made.
Mm-hmm.
Either like the Asgard from SG1, yeah.
Right, right.
Either by this
Which
point,
is actually based off that conspiracy theory. So the conspiracy theory was before the Asgard were created for the story.
right. But I feel like it's entirely plausible there is a law that says that you can that we have to be able to keep the original genome somehow. But I feel like the ship may have sailed, like that was captured 200 years after we've been spending time screwing around with it. And then
Mhm.
somebody said, oh no. And that actually might be kind of an interesting thing to explore right away in the story, because Alex's genome would be perfect, would
Mhm.
be original, right? Because she's coming from 2024 or 2028 or
Yeah.
whatever.
Mhm.
So her genome would be completely unmolested, and
There
that would
could,
make her very valuable.
there could be some like not necessarily secret, but there could be like an actual intergalactic effort where there's scientists from all around that are specifically working on like how do we save the human species from just degrading into nothingness.
Right. Well,
And
and this,
representatives would come to interview uh, the one from the past.
yeah, Alex, yeah. They'd be constantly, I think she'd be very valuable to people. I mean, the problem, of course, is she has no Y chromosome. So that's going to be an issue where they're only going to be able to get one source. And since Earth was so screwed up, there's no way to get original source material. I guess there's no easy way to get original source material from the humans on Earth. So you have the 65,000 people that we rescued, and that's it.
Mhm.
And so the genome, even though it was because the aliens had no idea, it was exactly. Maybe there are others out there. I actually had thought about that too. I thought about pushing the event that caused everything down the road about maybe 20 years. So 2040 or 2045, thereabouts. And then having some people have left.
So here's a weird thought that popped into my head. Okay.
As opposed to all the other weird thoughts.
Yes. So,
Okay.
but this is pertaining to Alex's time.
Uh-huh.
All right. So the people that were left behind, they never died. Earth to them is still in existence.
They are.
However, they evolved over time, just like the other humans that escaped the event,
Mm-hmm.
to live within the event.
Yep.
And so you could write in that they eventually do get a male specimen, but it's a convict
Right.
that was expelled willingly.
That is an interesting idea. I actually had played with the idea that Earth is still operating in some way. Like there was a large extinction event. It wiped out a lot of people, but a certain number of people stayed. But since the event that caused it has caused such a disruption in space-time, you can't get to the planet. So you can't actually go onto the planet to see anything, and they can't get out. And so we just assume there's a book, one of my favorite books, written by a guy named Werner Venge, and it's called Across Real Time, and it's one of my absolute favorite books ever, ever, ever. And actually, this is such my favorite book that I managed to get Werner Venge's signature on it. Wahahaha. He was like, "What?" It was very funny. Anyway,
So, is the event that happened on Earth kind of similar to something like, remember when Voyager gets stuck around a planet who's out
yeah,
of
wink of an eye,
time?
blink of an eye, blink of an eye, because wink of an eye is an original series episode.
Mhm.
Blink of an eye, yeah, where the planet is stuck in a different time frame and
Mhm.
it's evolving faster, and Voyager is the sky ship.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. I thought about that. So in Werner Venge's Across Real Time, they invent this super devastating weapon called the bobble, and you sling it at somebody, and it locks them in this sphere that's impenetrable. And the sphere is, they even try to nuke the sphere at some point in time, and it can't, nothing penetrates it. And they noticed that, you know, people who, so they, you know, they sit there and go, well, what you're doing is you're making an impenetrable force field around them that doesn't break for years. So clearly they're suffocating and dying inside there. And later on, what they discover, of course, is that it's not, it's a frozen moment in time. So they're locking the moment.
Mhm.
And the bobble bursts, and the person's in the middle of a sentence and comes out still saying the sentence, you know, whatever. So it was a fascinating sort of story, because like there were two halves of the story. The first half was a mutually assured destruction story where the two countries were threatening to bobble each other, and then finally they bobbled up all the cities, and then that was the end. And then the world sort of fell into disrepair because, you know, every major city got bobbled up. And then the second half is a city that traveled around bobbling itself up, because they figured out how to figure out when the bobbles were going to burst. So they'd go to each bobble, find out how long it was going to take, set their bobble for bursting about, you know, 2 minutes or 3 minutes before the other bobble burst. Then they'd bobble themselves up. The bobble would burst. That bobble would burst. They'd say, "Hi, welcome to civilization." You know, and so it was kind of a fascinating two parts to the story. The best
Mhm.
part about that story, though, was it was a murder mystery, because one of the main characters of that story, she was setting up to do the bobble, and they pushed her outside the bobble as the city bobbled up for 350 years. And there was nobody out there but monkeys
Mhm.
for 350 years. She died. Obviously, she died of old age
Right.
while the bobble was bobbled up. And it was a fascinating story, because then as soon as the bobble unbobbled, they realized that she wasn't there. Where is she? Where'd she go? And then they find all these cairns all around the bobble where she left trails of her story. And it was an amazing, mind-boggling story. I loved it. It was the best.
It was mind-boggling.
It was mind-boggling. Oh. Um, but it was a great story, and it was interesting. But I feel like that, in a way, that might be exactly what has happened.
Mhm.
Is Earth still has people, but they're inside this rupture of space-time, so you can't get into her and they can't get out.
Hmm.
So,
Do they even know they're in one anymore? Like,
right, they don't know what happened. They may not even know because this would have been 2040.
hmm
As far it would have been like today if all of a sudden the sky started becoming silver and reflecty and all this stuff, and then people started dying, and like houses disappeared and sections of the planet got ripped out, and and then all of a sudden it stopped, and then it was just daytime again, and then nighttime, and then daytime, and then nighttime, and you're like, okay, what was that? So from the point of view of the people on Earth, who knows?
hmm
Although I do think in the story I had specifically written that there were people who tried to attack the aliens that were taking people off the Earth, that were evacuating people
hmm
because they didn't understand what was going on. And so there is a part of the story where they would have seen aliens,
hmm
so they probably would have just assumed that this was some kind of alien attack and moved from there.
I imagine they would probably done something similar to Babylon 5, where basically after Earth is pretty much abandoned, it devolves, and then at the end you see them. Sorry, spoiler alerts. They're going back, but they have to pretend to be like in the medieval times because that's where the people who are still on Earth are at because they kind of devolved and are building back up.
Yeah, I wonder if we would devolve that. I'm reading a book series right now, which clearly takes place on another planet, but it's all medieval, like high fantasy. It's a weird mix. The planet that they're on is orbiting a red sun, and it has a huge magnifying glass in orbit around this planet. And so, as the sun and the magnifying glass align, it cuts a warmth band through the middle of this planet. And initially, the band was wide and it had polar ice caps, but the orbit of that mirror, that orbit of that magnifying glass has been decaying over the last 1,000, 2,000 years. So the band has been getting narrower and narrower, and now that's what he was saying was B5 did that. The band has been getting narrower and narrower, and now they have walls of ice that are closing in on their cities, and their cities are only around the equator. And it's been so long, they've lost control of the magnifying glass.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know how to control it, except to use magic, which isn't really magic.
Yeah.
It's channeling the technology that once existed on this planet 100 billion years ago or whatever. Not really 100 billion, but you get the idea.
Well, as Marvel stated, what one person's magic is another's
That's the Clark Law.
science.
Yep. Clark Law says that any sufficiently advanced technology will be viewed as magic.
Yep.
So, but I mean, the thing is that they've also reverted to horses and carriages and swords and sorcery and chainmail and plate mail and a feudalistic society. And I'm wondering if we really would devolve to feudalism. Is that the last? Is that the last place where society had a pin?
I don't know if necessarily feudalism. I mean, we might devolve even further back.
Right.
I believe that because I've learned that as a human species, we just have an incredibly short memory.
Right.
And
which is amazing since we are the creatures that invented writing.
Right. And one of the benefits of being as advanced as we are is that we have the privilege of becoming so specialized in such small sections of various activities in life that if there was ever a breakdown, no one of us knows enough about anything to rebuild anything anymore. So in Budget Rising's case, if a significant amount of the population is just taken, that it's over and we have to start over.
Thundar the Barbarian says we'll become feudal again. It's true. Hey, Aaron, welcome to the show. Aaron's a buddy of mine from New York, so we usually do the Synthaholics podcast together. So it's kind of cool to see Aaron on here.
Hey, Aaron.
So, but yeah, it's something I've been kind of pondering on this one, which is, would we? And I guess my thought is, why feudalism? Why medieval? I mean, other than the romance of the medieval culture. I mean, why do science fiction people return to medievalism? And I really, and probably it's because technically medievalism lasted from like 2000 BC until 1890. You know what I mean? Like it like ran forever. That's all right, Brian. It's cool. You join when you can. We're just sitting here discussing the higher topics of Bellatrix Rising.
My theory is the reason that writers probably choose medieval times is because the kind of technology that was involved in those times was, derived pretty easily from nature. Mechanics that you could use, like wooden gears, or it was just fire and brick. It was something that we could relatively build up to fast enough, but then people don't realize like how many shoulders we're standing on today from that point. That to get like a CPU, it would take lifetimes to
Right.
build back up from that stage to building a CPU again.
But Steam, I mean, like I could probably build a viable automobile engine, internal combustion engine. I certainly could build a big enough, me personally, could build an electric motor. You know what I mean? Like I personally could do that. I know how to make an electric. I mean, we built those in science class, right? Remember when we had to take the magnet and wrap the wire around the magnet, so we could put it in the thing?
But would you be able to find wire, right?
Right. But
So
I mean, if you've got Bronze Age, Copper Age, you can make wire because you can melt the copper.
You can make crude wire. Yeah.
Right. It doesn't have to be seriously powerful. It just has to be enough to tote me back and forth to market. You know what I mean? like that's all.
Yeah, well, also engines are rather precision things. Even like the first ones that came about took a lot of trial and error to get that kind of precision, so that timings and all that.
But again, back to I wonder whether if we devolved, would we devolve? I mean, because I assume that the problem is the moment we stop working together. Because really, I guess if there was ever a Guy's law is it takes 30,000 people to put a man on the moon. No matter which way you look at it, it takes 30,000 people to put a man on the moon. And they all have to work together, and they all have to do the same thing. And
they need, each of those needs 30,000 people to create an infrastructure for them
to exist.
Their time on that one task.
And you could probably say, in all fairness, if you include the Wright brothers in all of these, the people that had to get to the moon, it would take 1 million people to get to the moon. So you need to have 1 million people all working together on the same world to get to a point where that happens. So if you get to a point where you can't get 1 million people to work the same concept, then you lose the moon. If you get to the point where you can't get 1,000 people to do the same concept, you get to the point where you really can't even get automobiles anymore. So there's a point where like it's how much we work together as a team. And see you later, Booma.
And if there's a catastrophe and people are so concerned with just getting food the next day,
right?
There's no working together until those basic things are accommodated.
Right. Well, that's one of the things. Agriculture changed the way humans work, because one person could feed 10, which meant that 9 people could do something else.
Right.
And that was a major shift in the way humans operated. As soon as agriculture came along, you had people who didn't have a job anymore. So they were free to think of something else like mathematics or, whatever, and ultimately science. So you need to have that freedom. And if everybody is down to sustenance, then you're right. That's exactly what happens. We devolve because we lose the ability to hold all of that. So, although we still have one benefit, and that is for a good portion of our learning period, we're unable to hunt for food, which is still a portion of biology that makes humans different than other animals. All other animals, you only have about a year before your young can hunt for food on their own.
Right.
Whereas humans, we have to spend 10 or 11 years before we're able to hunt for food, during which time you've got nothing better to do than learn language and science.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like, so as long as you've got,
We're so specialized now. If we needed to go back to that, like, I don't even think people would know. Like, even if they were to get a kill, I
yeah,
mean, there's cleaning procedures. You have to, learning on how to butcher it,
how
learning
to,
on how
how
to
to
cook it
cook it so that you don't get
safely.
sick.
Yeah, like we don't even know that.
Well, and that's the thing. Brian just said that my world is filled with competent people. And it is, because I actually do believe that in general, a human being by themselves is super competent.
Mhm.
Um, I think that people can be misled. I think people can be wrong. And I think that causes the appearance that we're idiots.
Mhm.
But I think in reality, if you said the fate of the world is at stake here, people will buckle down and do the job. You know what I mean? They'll just get it done.
Mhm.
And I feel like, yeah, well, I mean, we will have outriggers, certainly. But I feel like the world will never really go to a point where we completely devolve because everybody is an idiot. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? I feel like, you know,
Well, I
well,
mean,
yeah, most people don't know what plants are edible, but I do know not to drink Drano.
right.
You know what I mean? Like, it's because, well, yeah, I mean, like, we've got issues, but again, you could chalk that one up to misinformation or propaganda, or there's all kinds of stuff kind of going on that causes the sides. I was actually thinking of this the other day, talking to a buddy of mine who is politically opposite of me. And I'm like, how in the world do you get to this position? And then I'm like, well, I guess if all you hear is this news feed and all I hear is this news feed, one can argue that maybe neither one of us are wrong, but just misled.
Mhm.
I mean, like, you can't, we've gotten to a point now where there's so much information, you have to pare it down. And when you pare it down, you end up with a subsection of the information, which
Mhm.
could easily mislead you. So, um, right. Well, and that's the thing, right? I'm not sure about all people being competent. The problem is the average IQ is 100, which makes sense, right? Because it's a range of about, like, 70 to about 130, 140, right? Is your average, or the spread, which puts 100 right in the middle. At 100 IQ, you can still, learn to get food. You can learn to figure out how to get a house. Um, so, but when you talk about things that are cutting edge, like exploring space or things like that, I feel like you need to be at a higher IQ level.
I think for the beginning, for what's the phrase?
I'm going off on tangents, Bill. I'm sorry if I'm
No,
over.
no, no. The frontier. So, whenever you're exploring the frontier, the people that are out there. So, like, going back to the worst Star Trek series in my opinion, Enterprise, right? The whole beginning of it is they're out there, they're laying communication buoys, or they're literally setting stuff up. So in order to be those first ones, you have to be on that other level so that you can lay the infrastructure for the people who are on a different level to come behind you.
Right. The average
Yeah.
is going to have to come in behind us. And we have to kind of remember that things like automobiles are still relatively new in
Mhm.
our culture.
Right.
So the average is going to have a problem with it still. They're still sort of not perfectly cutting edge. I mean, I wouldn't call it necessarily cutting edge, but
Mhm.
I keep thinking about my great grandmother who in 1912 or 1914 or something like that, she got into a Model T, she pressed the wrong pedal, and she put the Model T into a ditch, which almost killed my grandmother, right? Because my grandmother was like an infant and it didn't have seat belts and it didn't have safety. And the
Mhm.
glass broke and there were shards of glass everywhere. And, my grandmother was ejected and thrown into the ditch and the car almost rolled over on her, things like that.
Yeah.
My great grandmother never drove again. She died in 1994 without a driver's license ever. She'd never gotten a driver's license.
Mhm.
And it's just because to her, she couldn't understand it. It didn't make sense. My great grandmother wasn't stupid. She was very competent.
Mhm.
Um, if my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a wagon. Okay, now we're quoting Scotty. But I mean, like, I think about this all the time. She wasn't stupid. She just,
Mhm.
cars were beyond her. And as a kid that was born in 1972, I mean, it was part of my culture to have a car when I was 16.
Mhm.
That's part of the culture now. Like I scrambled to get my license.
Mhm.
I fought to get my first car. And you look at it from the point of view of my great grandmother, and she's like, those things are too weird. She didn't even have a clue how PCs work. She had no idea. She didn't care.
I
She
think it's
figured
a matter of
she was good.
I, I don't even think it's not the ability to comprehend or to use it. I think it's from my perspective, growing up in that computer age and like my my career's biggest career started in computers and whatnot, and is teaching people on how to use them. So I grew up on literally teaching people on how to use a computer. Where today you grow up with it, you don't even you learn it just by it's there and you use it.
Right.
I think my perception is that at some point it's got to be a chemistry or biological thing, where at some point your brain is like, okay, these are the tools. I know how to use the tools. These are the tools I am going to use to get through the rest of my life.
Right.
And there are no other tools, and I don't have time for that. I gotta use the tools I know about and go.
Right.
And some people don't have that and are a little bit more adaptable, and some people are less.
Right.
There's going to be a bell curve of it.
Sure.
That's what I feel like it is.
Well, and we're ejecting tools.
Mhm.
Kat had just mentioned most people don't even know what plants are edible,
Mhm.
right? I don't. If you put me out there and said, that's it, you're on your own, good luck, I'd be dead in a couple of days because I'd find some mushroom and eat it. And then that'd be the end of it. Be like,
I,
hey, it's a mushroom, right? I can eat mushrooms.
I
And
can identify some plants, but I'd be like, but that's what it looks like, and I don't trust myself
right.
to like eat it.
Well, not only that, I can't kill an animal. I would empathize with the animal. I'd cry over it. It'd be horrible, right? I mean, like just killing a rabbit to eat a
Mhm.
rabbit for dinner would just, I'd be devastated.
I can kill some animals. Like if it came down to like I needed to eat.
Depending on auto captions, that's got to be fascinating.
If it came down to eating any common household pet, I don't think I could do it.
Yeah,
But
no,
like a wild boar, my mind would be getting over the. So I used to watch the series Monsters Inside Me, and it
Mhm.
was about like parasites and stuff. And I know there's a lot of parasites in boar. And
Yeah.
I'm like, I could probably kill it, but I'm like, I am cooking this thing till it's a charcoal briquette.
Right.
I can't get over it in my head that I'm going to end up with monsters inside me now.
Right, with these parasites.
Hmm.
Oh. But that's the same thing. Like, you're right. If it came down to eating George for there'd be no way. That'd be just horrible.
I used to joke with my cat, like nachos are backup food supply, but I couldn't
Right.
take
But you wouldn't be able to really do it.
it. Yeah.
Right. But I mean, we've lost that skill.
Mhm. Yeah.
I mean, you think about the fact that, people would go out and slaughter an animal and ha 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 ha.
Mhm.
But it's interesting. This brings me to another sort of thought process. They were talking about this on the Daystrom Institute, which is a subreddit on Reddit where they sort of deep dive on aspects of Star Trek. And they were talking about data and being a being, and why is it you don't perceive the Enterprise's primary C word, because I don't want to trigger Alexa, um, as a being, but you do perceive Discovery's primary. Um, uh, come on, Zora. You do perceive Zora as a cognizant being, and you perceive Data as a cognizant being. But you need a slave to some degree, and Guinan had kind of tilted into this one a little bit in Measure of a Man, because Guinan had said, imagine an entire race of disposable beings going and doing all the dangerous things so you don't have to. And that's an interesting concept. And
Mhm.
I was thinking about this too. What is the definition of being? What is the definition of, because they were talking about sentience or sapience, which are two different types of word, versus intelligence.
Mhm.
Like, my phone has intelligence. My
Mhm.
phone, you could even argue, is self aware. If its battery starts to die, it complains and
Mhm.
tells you to help it.
Yeah.
So it is cognizant of its own battery state. It can tell you whether it's got wireless connection or a cellular connection. Therefore, it is aware of itself.
I think it orbits around the nebulous definition of consciousness.
And soul.
Well,
I
I don't
mean,
even know if it's soul. It's the ability to not only be aware of yourself, but also care. Like your phone knows its battery's going to die, but does it care?
and what is care?
Yeah, right. Does it have some emotional uh,
And
reflection upon its
are
state?
emotions
Right,
critical?
right.
Because the thing is,
Yeah, and that's why I defined it as nebulous because
it is
you
nebulous.
can't even define consciousness
But
without.
I mean, like, the scene that I'm writing right here,
Well, it's-
I'm writing a scene where um, where Chang is she misses Jen, the original AI that was on the ship, who's been replaced by Navin, right? She misses Jen. And when confronted about this, she says, well, you know that Navin's only 3 years old, right? He's just a baby. And of course, then Bennett's response is 3 years old is age of sentience for synthetics or AIs or whatever we're going to call them. I've forgotten, they're very small words right now. I took a note on my comic, but it's tiny in the margin, and I've zoomed out. Anyway, and she goes, no, it's not that. Jen was nurturing and calm, and Navin is a spaz, and indicating that it has nothing to do with, for Chang, it has nothing to do with age. It's the fact that Navin, like all young beings, is energetic and spazzy, and Jen was an older being. Um, you hate tier 3 IT people. We're with you. And This is an important scene in my comic because it illustrates that they treat synthetic life forms as if they are people because of their emotional response. And you had just said, do you care? And that's making me really think. Do I care?
Mhm.
Do I care if I die? Do I care if I live? Sure. Do I stop being a being the moment I have depression?
Well,
You know what I
even
mean?
depression is a form of caring, right? So I
That's
imagine
true.
if you were to walk up to Data and he was like a complete sociopath. Like he didn't care if you liked him, didn't
Or
like him. He didn't care to be human. He didn't care if you walked up and removed his arm and walked away. And he could just hold a conversation. Cool. Would you consider him alive anymore? I don't. I think it would be harder unless he had any care about anything.
right.
He would just be a computer. I think.
Lore cares. Just Lore cares sociopathically.
Exactly. He cares only about himself, right?
Right, but he cares.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think care is the defining line.
Mm-hmm.
Because Data was talking about in Measure of a Man an ineffable quality,
Mm-hmm.
a flavor to the memories. I have a bunch of memories. You have a bunch of memories. My PC has a bunch of memories.
Mm-hmm.
But there's an ineffable quality to the feel, the flavor of my memories. I have written down in a log somewhere that you and I went to the store. That's fine.
Mm-hmm.
So it's in text somewhere. My PC knows that you and I went to the store. You can look on my Google search history. You can see that you and I went to the store. But the discussion that we had, even if you recorded it, even if we recorded the discussion between us that, it was a great discussion about, I don't know, pizza. We talked about pizza. It was a fun discussion. We enjoyed it. Even if we recorded that and saved that to our PC, the PC doesn't care.
Mm-hmm.
All of the memories are there. It remembers just like we remember that discussion. It knows where we went just like we knew where we went. But we cared.
Mm-hmm.
I like that definition. I really do. I think that's the line. Do
Yeah.
you care? I'm going to write that down before I forget it. I am writing a whole bunch of stuff in the margins of this comic. This is going to be like the most important comic thing.
Yeah. At least that I would say is humanity's definition, right? I don't know what silicates would think or what other species would use to define it, but certainly I think intrinsically that's what humans would define it as.
Well, no, that there has to be an overriding rule. Why do I kill a chicken to eat it?
Mm-hmm.
Don't I kill you
Mm-hmm.
to? There has to be a defining rule. Ironically, my character in D&D is going through this right now
Mm-hmm.
as a humorous, funny thing because she's from another dimension. She's from a hell dimension, and she's trying to be a good person and fit in just fine in normal society.
Right.
But she has a real problem with the fact that people don't eat other people.
Mhm.
But you do eat these other animals.
Mm-hmm.
She's okay if you were a vegetarian. That would make
And we
sense.
consider most of those animals conscious.
Right. And maybe she likes those animals. What's the definition? So,
Right.
a sapient life form. I agree with the people on oh, come on, I have to Daystrom Institute. There is a difference between sentience and sapience. Sentience is aware of itself. My phone is sentient.
Mm-hmm.
But sapience, whether you have a soul,
Mm-hmm.
if you will, and I'm using that we understand that I'm agnostic, atheistic. I don't believe in a higher being, yada yada yada. So soul is, I'm using this term in a detached mode. So I'm using it as sort of a thought process for just what's that ineffable quality.
Mm-hmm.
Do you care? Like, it's important. Does my phone fear its battery dying?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the battery's dying. My phone's like, so what? My
Mhm.
battery's dying. I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
I have no internet connection. So what? But then the next question is sapience dependent on simply having hormone sacs in your body
Mm-hmm.
that like an adrenaline gland?
Yeah. Well, I think you could subscribe those.
Totally in Ghost of the Shell territory. This is
Right.
science fiction. I'm writing a science fiction opera.
Right.
I mean, like,
Are,
it's not a space opera. I've been doing it forever.
are those just chemical computers that are components in a larger system?
Right. Is that a system? Like,
Yeah.
could I program my phone to
Okay.
freak out if
Right.
it runs out of battery? And if so, did I give it sapience?
Yeah. Or is it just following some narrative to get you to recognize it as one?
Right, because we all know that our adrenaline glands are there to keep us from getting eaten by a tiger.
Right.
We only care
Mm-hmm.
about getting eaten because we don't want to die before we reproduce
Mm-hmm.
and make children. It's the only reason we care.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Colton.
I'd argue people that have already reproduced also care.
Right, but I mean, like, it's mechanical.
Yeah.
Like, I have 2 cats.
Mm-hmm.
One is terrified of her own shadow.
Mm-hmm.
Last night, my wife coughed. She had a coughing fit all night, and my cat was bolting from the bed every time she coughed. Okay, why did my cat care?
Mm-hmm.
And does that make her sentient or sapient?
Yeah.
You know, she had an adrenaline rush. She ran from the bed. It terrified the hell out of
Yeah.
her. Now the question is, was she sapient?
It,
Ooh, I
if,
love this.
given my definition, we would recognize it as sentient. That doesn't mean it is. It's just that's how we perceive and define it. It doesn't mean that it is.
I saw a video that I did not watch because I wasn't going to do it, where a donkey was standing on a railroad track and the train hit the donkey.
Oh no, I wouldn't want to watch
Yeah, I'm not going to watch it. I couldn't stand it. I
Mhm.
couldn't. I just read the descriptions
that. Mm-hmm.
because it was marked NSFW, and usually what I do when it's marked NSFW is read the comments before watching it, and I read the comments and said, "Nope, I'm noping out of this." But the question I had on this one was, why didn't the donkey move?
Mm-hmm.
That train was blaring its horn, blaring its horn, blaring its horn,
Mm-hmm.
and the donkey stood on the tracks and ultimately got run over by the train.
It didn't perceive it as a threat.
How did it not perceive literally thousands of tons of metal coming at it at full speed, making a loud noise?
So there's a story about what is it when Columbus
Right.
was coming to the New World, that the native peoples, when they looked out at the sea and there were the ships, and the Columbus's crew were talking to them like, the ship's right there, and they were like, we don't see what you're talking about, we don't get it. They couldn't conceive of
What a ship
what
is.
ships are, so they couldn't see it. It literally, the brain couldn't process it into anything to make it make sense to them. So it just was not there for them. For the donkey doesn't know what a train is. He has no comprehension of it. So it's just not there as far as it's concerned.
Yeah. Yeah, I keep thinking about that and thinking that that's it's a thing that's fascinating to me, is thinking about this. What is sapience on this one?
Mhm.
What makes us Homo sapiens? Because one, yeah, the donkey blue screened. I did not watch. I couldn't even. I didn't want to watch it. I have watched some rather horrifying car crashes, but I've gotten really good at, if it's marked not safe for work,
Mhm.
reading the comments section. And if they start talking about body parts going different places, I'm not watching it.
That's why I often imagine, like, when people talk about, like, if aliens landed, we would freak out. In my head, I'm like, I'm not even sure half of us would even
Notice it.
notice it, see it, acknowledge it. Like, we would probably just think, especially if you weren't there seeing it, you might not even believe it. You might be like, yeah, whatever, aliens, sure, haha.
Well, and that's one of those things that also, if aliens aren't landing in spaceships that look like the Enterprise, we probably wouldn't even perceive it as what
Mhm.
you're trying to kind of get to, because you're right. I
Yeah.
think that things occur that it's funny how much Douglas Adams had like a real good solid concept of the world, of
Mhm.
people. Like some of the things he says in his book that we all go ha 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 ha, ha. And then later on you're like, well, no, actually that's pretty correct. Like, I mean, he talks about somebody else's problem, the SEP fields,
Mhm.
where the people would just put up an SEP field and it wouldn't matter because everybody around you would just assume you're somebody else's problem.
Mhm.
And so aliens walked among us all the time. They just walked among us with an SEP field around them,
Mhm.
and everybody just assumed we were somebody else's problem, so they just
Mhm.
ignored us.
Right.
And so you had like these 17 heads and 27 feet, and they're just walking down the street and all this stuff, and nobody noticed because of the SCP field.
Right.
And to some degree, I'm kind of thinking you may be onto something with that. Effectively is what we're talking about.
Mhm.
There may be spaceships sitting right there in that park right across the street
Mhm.
here. I wouldn't know because I just cannot comprehend what that is.
I mean, it all comes down to that, you know, how the brain literally makes up reality.
Yeah.
Like, you're only getting bits and pieces of everything going on around you, and your brain sews it all together into a nice little narrative for you. But there's a whole bunch of stuff you didn't catch.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the arguments that they make all the time with CSI. When they're talking about interviewing people who've seen a crime, is you only got so much data out of it,
Hmm.
and there's so much that you missed, and so yep, Ghost Hands talking about the fourth dimensional beings. But you're right. I mean, like, that's a fascinating thought. There could be like right now aliens standing right behind me.
Hmm.
Who knows? And even we wouldn't, looking into this camera and you're looking behind me, and right here is an alien, and you don't know it because we wouldn't know.
Yeah.
What would we know?
And
You know?
there's evidence. Like, there's those experiments they do where they'll have a scene and it's like basketball players, and there's a guy in a bear suit walking in the back, and they'll ask you at the end, "Did you see anything weird about that scene?" And no one saw the bear walking in the back because you just filter it out.
Yeah, you filter it out. Aaron has been seeing faces in the back of my office back here. He keeps seeing, and I'm like, I never saw that until you said something, Aaron, and now I can't unsee it.
Mhm.
But you're right. Like the bear suit basketball thing is a perfect example of this. Um, Malcolm Gladwell is an author who wrote a series and he had a book that he wrote called Blink, and it's all about assumptions, presumptions, and conceived notions, and how it's hard to fight our own biases, even if we try. Um, like he was one of the things that I love that he had talked about was um, in the 70s, 80s, the Chicago Philharmonic Orchestra was all male, all white male. And as the 80s came along, people were starting to feel like that was probably not appropriate. And so they would hold auditions and specifically look for minorities, look for women, and stuff like that. But even as the 80s came to an end and the 90s began, they still only had they were 90% white male. And they were like, maybe just women aren't interested in playing music. maybe minorities aren't, maybe it's our demographic in Chicago where we are. We just don't have enough people who are around us. And so they came up with the ability, or what they did was they decided to block the stage. So the judges who were judging the performers couldn't see them.
Mhm.
And then and if you came onto stage and you said anything, you weren't allowed to say anything. You weren't allowed to speak. You had to take your shoes off so that nobody could hear the difference between high heels and flats, like tennis shoes. And you were not allowed to do anything that would give away anything. And what happened was their diversity level went up to almost 50%.
Yep.
And it was because what Malcolm Gladwell was saying was you'd end up with like a 5-foot tall Asian woman playing a tuba. And your perception is there's no way she has enough volume in her lungs. She has enough size to hold the instrument. So you're preconceived. It's not a racism thing. You've made the assumption in your head that she can't play it
Mhm.
because she's too small for the instrument.
She doesn't fit the part.
Right. She doesn't fit the
Oh,
part.
right.
And so they ended up, that's actually literally what they had. Their
Mhm.
tuba player was, for a long time, this really tiny Asian woman
Mhm.
who was unbelievably good, but she had the most incongruous instrument for her body frame. And they wouldn't have hired her because they would have assumed she was not doing a good job. But when they blocked the stage and they could not see her, they hired her on her merits alone. And when they did, it was a fascinating thing. But it's fascinating that parts of this are shorthand. What we do with shorthand, we shorthand out things because there's just too much information. That's what the crux of that book is.
Mhm.
It's not a matter of it's a matter of we're overloaded with data, and so we have to shorthand. We
Mhm.
cannot actively process everything.
Right.
We must shorthand. And what ends up happening is we end up by accident stereotyping.
Mhm.
And it's a function of human inability to process all the data that's coming in, the stereotyping. And that's one of the reasons what Malcolm Gladwell's comment is one of the reasons why we have to work on breaking stereotypes intentionally. We have to fight those stereotypes directly because you can't just hope that people will get over the stereotypes. They won't. The stereotypes are a shorthand. We've made a program in our brain so that we don't have to process all the subdata.
Mhm.
It's also one of the reasons why I've noticed bits and pieces of things like I'm willing to accept all kinds of stuff, but only because I met people who were doing the things.
Mhm.
I mean, like I can accept that D&D is not satanic, but only because I played D&D.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like
I was never allowed to play it because that's what my mom believed.
right, but and that was a big push in the
Mhm.
70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
And now we all know that there's nothing wrong with D&D.
Yeah.
It's like everybody understands that, but you had to break that stereotype.
Mhm.
You know, Brent is a fifth dimensional being, so there's that. That's why we can't see
Mhm.
him. We look right at Brent.
Mhm.
Oh, fascinating. Do they have D&D in Bellatrix? I would assume that they have some. I know that they have, because of the Deus Thati, they've got fictional storytelling that is team based.
Mhm.
So that would be essentially role playing. But the Deus Thati are story driven. Everything they do is about the story, capturing histories, telling stories, passing stories down, things like that. Their entire culture is based around that.
I'd
And
imagine if,
a big part of their world. I'm sorry, what?
I'd imagine if there are humans, there's people who want to live vicariously through a story, be something other than they are.
Well, I mean, we will always have escapism.
Yeah.
I mean, we watch TV, we play games, we do all of that to escape. And probably, as Malcolm Gladwell was talking about, it's because we are being bombarded every day with so much data
Mhm.
that at some point we just kind of have to take a break and break out of this data overload coming in from our world. Our world is complex. I mean, but even if you went back to the days of early man, that world was complex too, just not complex in the same way.
Uh, it was complex for the knowledge set that they had, I would say.
And we're gonna play what was that thing? People and what was I forgot. There was a Far Side-esque cartoon with a whole bunch of dragons sitting around the table, and they were all playing like offices and whatever. And like, and they were like, you come home and your wife says, "Where have you been?" And the other one's like, "Oh no, man, you're gonna have to roll for this one. Oh, this is dangerous." Like the dragons are all sitting around the table. It was like, I love that. That was a funny comic. But I mean, like,
So this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Not to derail too far into politics,
derail.
but
Well, we can't go too far into politics without getting into dangerous territory that
No,
Pepper
no.
and I discovered already.
I'm going to keep it real basic. It's that the systems that we currently live in, I feel, were designed for a time where most people were on the same page, right? You grew up in a time where there's only so many things you can know. There's only so many careers.
Right.
For our founding fathers, it was like most of them farmed. They were making whiskey. They were raising horses. They were lawyers. But there's only so many things you can do, and when you're a couple of them, you probably just assumed a large collection of the possible things you could do in life back then. So when they came together to draft various rules and systems that we would all live by, they did so in a world where pretty much everyone's relatively on the same page.
Right.
Most people are of the relevant same intelligence, because if you weren't, you probably died. And everyone, like I said, is pretty much on the same page. Today, we have a wider distribution, and we're not all on the same page anymore.
Right.
And I don't think we can be, just because of the way we specialize. So our system still makes sense, and that's why, like, when we're talking about the way the system works in your world, it's, we're talking about how, like, responsibility based on your level and talent and how intelligent you are, the level of responsibility. But those are some of the things I was thinking about lately and whatnot. And so he's interrupting with that, and he wants some attention. So.
Well, yeah, but I wanted to say one real quick thing. I, somewhere along the line, decided to look into how whiskey is made as a side note. That's freaking complex. There's a lot of things to do, and you can screw it up and set fire to your place. And I mean, like, all kinds of great stuff. It's not, and I think that
but it's not building a CPU from the ground up, right?
No, it's not, but we don't. You don't.
So there are levels of complexity.
Yeah.
Is my point. Just because
you want us to stop talking, is that what you're after here?
Huh?
I'm asking Pepper if he wants us to stop talking.
I think he wants attention about his little horse thing.
I was actually singing Brave Sir Robin a minute ago in reference to that.
So,
but yeah, I mean, that's the thing is like beer is complicated. It's not an easy thing, and you need equipment. You need, I mean, you can't just make beer in your sink. You need to know. I mean, I know that they make bathtub.
Oh, but you don't want to, but sometimes if you really wanted to do, yeah, you probably could.
I would say it's simple enough for backwoods hillbillies.
Right, but it's still kind of
one of together without buying anything that's specialized.
But I mean, it is still complex, and that's what you do, right? Well, and if you think about building CPUs, you're not building a CPU. You're building, like, I've got a buddy in Japan. That's what he does, is design circuits. That's his job. But he doesn't actually make the circuits. He takes a piece of paper and he draws this to this and draws that to that and does this and does that, and then sets the voltage and sets, he's just designing, he's engineering the circuit, but he's not actually out there melting the pewter and pouring the lines. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
I didn't say any, I said pewter. Never mind. You know what I mean? Like, he's not, so that's back to what we were talking about before, which is the 1 million person rule. You have to be at the 1 million people working the same task level. If you don't have a million people to do it, and you have to have a million people who are fed and not sustenance living, you have to have a million people free. And so that's the level we have to be at. We have 320 million people in America. We can spare a million people to go to the moon.
Mhm.
We have enough resources. We have enough people in our culture because of that 320 million. 1 million is not a lot. You know what I mean?
There's only one problem if we colonize the moon.
The fact that they'd have way too much cheese and not enough, like, say, sausage or anything like that.
No,
Crackers.
if they go to the moon and they colonize the moon, moon dust particles are actually like little tiny shards of glass.
Yeah. Super abrasive. Mhm.
Yeah. So
You have to
essentially,
have showers.
yeah, you have to have like a ton of precaution going in and out. And as much as I would like to say that they get 1 million smart people, I don't think everyone's going to be super intelligent when
So
going to the moon.
the best thing I had ever seen about that was the refrigerator spacesuits. I love the refrigerator spacesuits. So
Well,
they
yeah,
effectively are spacesuits with, if you imagine, like a portable refrigerator on their back.
yeah,
And what happens is you back up to the space station and it docks, and then you open the refrigerator door and then climb out the back of the spacesuit into the space station.
yeah.
So
But the entire suit is made of like alloyed metal that can withstand the abrasion,
yeah.
and there's
Oh yeah.
absolutely no soft.
The moon dust gets into everything.
Yeah,
Martian dust gets into everything. Um,
Martian dust, from my understanding,
is worn
is a
down.
lot like pigments that I work with.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, like they're pervasive in a space. Like if you,
It's like blowing flour
yeah,
everywhere.
yeah, and
That's
you get
exactly what
to
it is.
places that you don't think that it actually be.
It'd
Um,
be like having airborne flour all the time in your house.
yeah.
It'd be like being in a bakery.
But with
Um,
dust, it's a little bit more dangerous because it literally, like, the first astronauts on the moon actually stated, like, no, like our suits were ripped up,
mhm. Oh yeah.
everything, and people thought that these reports were exaggerated,
No.
and
Part of it is because the moon has no water or air.
yeah,
And we don't think about the way that erosion works on rocks. And so when you break up a rock with no erosion to it, all you end up with is broken shards of the rock.
mhm,
And so as moon rocks get broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, instead of what we would have here on Earth, where the wind and the water would erode the spiky parts of the rock down, we don't get any of that on the moon. Everything stays spiky. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Moon dust is brutal. It is brutal. Um, and Martian dust gets everywhere because it's the other direction. It is super pulverized because of long exposure with nothing to, there's no tectonic activity to mull the rocks. So the rocks aren't getting mulled. So you have dust that's literally millions of years old. That's just become more and more dust. And it just gets more and more dust.
and the fact
And
that they have windstorms on Mars that like picks up this dust to be visible from to the naked eye.
right. Which was one of the major problems in The Martian that I had. I loved The Martian. It is such a wonderful, wonderful movie. However, a dust storm on Mars is like a fog.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, it's just fog.
Mm-hmm.
Everything just becomes foggy. And that's the way it goes because the winds are not powerful enough to actually push like they do here.
They're not
So you don't-
dense.
yeah, exactly. It's so it all what happens is a gentle breeze will come along, pick up a whole bunch of or Mars dust, and it will just sit there and fog. It's
But
low gravity and
yeah, I do want to get back to Brent talking about mead and beer. Honey mead is like super simple to make. You just have to make sure that you use the proper yeast because you can't use baker's yeast for that.
sure. Well, and that's kind of what I was saying was it really honestly, I think that the world is exactly as complex as it used to be. It's just that instead of all three of us being beer manufacturers, we all are instead three different kinds of specialization, but we still hold, let's say, 100 bits of information. And the founding fathers held 100 bits of information. The world probably only had 1 million bits back then, and today it has 1 billion bits. But each and every one of us still only hold 100 bits of it. It's just that now we have different bits to hold, and writing has helped us a whole lot. Literacy is critical. Having everybody be literate means that we all get to hold our 100 bits and pass it on to whoever else is interested in those 100 bits. So, like I was talking to Kat, Kat's got all this information that she's gathered about how to write manga. Okay, well, that's not important to Bill. You know what I mean? Like, he doesn't need to know what a focus frame is, and
Yeah,
he doesn't need to know how to lead and then follow on the following page. He doesn't need to know the difference between a 4-box method and a 6-box method or a 3-box method. But I do,
Mm-hmm.
and that information is important to me. And
Mm-hmm.
Kat's got that information, and she's willing to give it to me. And so she's got the 100 bits that I want to keep.
Mm-hmm.
I'll keep the 100 bits that she's got. She'll pass it on to me by writing a book, which I'm trying to encourage her to do, because I would read the heck out of that book.
Mm-hmm.
I'd buy the heck out of that book too.
That's why I think if you were to remove enough people, then your data would be corrupt.
Right. That's what would happen is
Yeah.
we lose aspects of our technology.
Mm-hmm.
But I also feel like it would be weird because I've thought of that too from the post diaspora part of where we are in Bellatrix Rising. What data would have made it past the jump? We would have absolutely people know how to make comic books, but nobody knows how to print them.
Mm-hmm.
Because the comic book artist got saved, but the printer didn't.
Right.
Right. So, it's like you'd have weird parts of the technology, and then you'd have weird parts of the technology that come in from the aliens. Like they're coming in, like for instance, they've got grand unification theory. Everything makes total sense. It's obvious. Well, humans didn't. They have no connection between gravity and weak force and strong force. None of those are connected mathematically for humans. Oh, yeah, well, it's easy. You just take x to the 4 to the 16th to this beep. What's a beep? Well, let me explain it to you. It's just a basic mathematical concept. Oh, bam, we've got grand unification theory.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we understand grand unification theory, but nobody knows how to work a toilet. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm-hmm.
this becomes one of those weird moments of how the world would have been in the initial parts of humankind early on after the diaspora. There's a lot of story in Bellatrix Rising that's going to end up being like written by me as a side story because I keep coming up with all this stuff and I'm like, well, that's a fascinating thing to talk about. Well, that's also fascinating, but has nothing to do with Chang. So it's like, meh. It all just exists in this ether that's above the story.
I think that's not partially tangential. I think that's why even when we have a specialty, we still have more that come and do it. And what advances, I believe, technology and things like that is not smarter people.
Mm-hmm.
It's people without their biases and preconceptions. That's why kids can come in, new people to the career, and they like solve problems and take it in a whole new direction. Not because they were smarter, but because they weren't already locked in and they weren't unable to see the other paths. Like once you kind of get locked into something, you can't see them anymore.
Right.
So,
Right. It's actually one of the reasons why autistic people
mm-hmm.
keep coming in with these brilliant theories. They're
Mm-hmm.
not brilliant. They didn't, well, they are brilliant, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not that. That's not the significance. The significance is that autism, one of the aspects of autism is missing social structure.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a defect, the defect, and I say this with, by the way, knowing that ADD is part of the autistic spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm talking about myself here to some degree, because I'm known all over the place. Like they love at NDK that I think outside the box. Well, the reason I think outside the box is because, just like you said, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not trapped in whatever it was. I never learned that social rule. I never learned that thing, whatever. So I had to make some program that runs. And instead of intuitively knowing that, of course, you don't do X, Y, or Z,
Mm-hmm.
I have a program that runs that says, remember, you're not supposed to do X, Y, or Z. So when someone comes in and says, we've got this problem with X, Y, or Z, everybody else is going, of course you do X, Y, or Z. And I'm like, I'm just going to suspend the program and look at this and see what I can do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I suspend the program. And then I'm like, well, isn't it obvious you do A, B, and C? And then everybody's like, no, that wasn't obvious. That's awesome. That's brilliant. It wasn't brilliance.
Yeah.
I just didn't have the preconceived notion that I'm supposed to do X, Y, or Z.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and autistic people do that all the time. I've watched a buddy of mine has an autistic child, and I've watched him as he processes things and what he goes through in his thinking process. It's fascinating. It's fascinating to watch this kid brilliantly come up with this thing. Well, he's suspending all the rules that his dad told him not to do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, no problem. But that's all he's doing. He's
Yeah.
suspending the rules and then doing the thing, answering the question. It's what kids do all the time. They walk in and go, well, why don't we just do it this way? And you're like, what? You know, all the time.
Mm-hmm. That's what I would tell people when I was teaching them on how to use a computer. And I'm like, why kids pick it up so easy is because they're not afraid. They're going to smash the buttons, figure it out. They're going to get it wrong.
Mhm.
They're going to learn from it and move on.
Mm-hmm.
Like as adults, you're afraid you're going to do something wrong, so you don't do it at all.
Right.
Like you have to get past that,
Right.
and then you'll be able to use a computer, and you'll be fine.
Absolutely. Well, and I'm noticing on the same token, those on the spectrum have a if there isn't a program, they can't do it. That's the other flaw to it.
Mm-hmm.
My kid does this all the time. All the time. He goes in there to empty the trash can, but there's no trash bag next to the trash can to put in a new trash bag.
Mm-hmm.
So he'll stand there, literally just lock up.
Mm-hmm.
It never occurs to him to go somewhere else or look around the house to find another trash bag or to use another thing that would work in lieu of a trash bag. He just stands there and locks up because he's got no program to run it. Now, the kid is brilliant in Legos. The kid is brilliant in math, but make him change the lining of a trash can with no lining sitting next to it, and there's a lockup. Doesn't know what to do.
Yep.
For the longest time, when he'd empty the dishwasher, he'd leave dishes in there, and I'd say, why are there dishes in here? And he's, well, I can't reach that shelf of the cabinet. And I'm like, why didn't you get a step ladder? And he was like, I didn't know I could. Yeah. Well, that's an obvious thing for you and me. not obvious for him. And
Guys,
I realized that at some point in time, it wasn't obvious for me either. I just had to make a program.
I'm just gonna let you know right now.
It's 7 minutes.
Using the program type deal, like my family literally had to teach me how to do that stuff.
Yep.
From a very early age.
Because we're on the spectrum,
Yeah.
we have run programs. But now you can run your household just fine, but you're running all those programs.
Yeah.
We do okay.
I'm
We do
empty
okay.
at best. If I'm working, I do not concern myself with anything else but work.
The dishes are in the sink piled up. It's my
Yeah.
job to load the dishwasher. I realized that last night when I went to bed. That and worse than that, my wife has been saying for about 3 days now, please load the dishwasher.
Mm-hmm.
And she's not wrong. I didn't do it. But for the same reason, I've been occupied. I am very driven to finish this comic and get it ready to go. And we are really, really, really painfully close to actually putting down pen to paper on issue 1. And like painfully close to it. And so like I'm pushing really hard, but it's still kind of a thing. Yeah. So there are a lot of things that we had some really great discussions about today. Thank you, Bill.
You're welcome.
This is a lot of fun. Your birthday gift is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I like how as we get older, we don't need necessarily Legos, although Legos are good. We're not saying Legos are bad. But it is interesting how this is what we want sometimes for our birthdays. We just want an interesting, stimulating discussion, or donuts, or both. Could be both. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
He already said that once. It's funny. He's just remembering it now. Okay, well, did you have anything else? We've got about 6 minutes left. Did you have anything else you wanted to dive into?
When we were talking about the moon and Mars, the other thing I could think of is I have this concept of what I think we should do, and that's people keep talking about how difficult it would be to like mine certain things like asteroids.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, why don't we just create autonomous robots that go, chunk it up, and just push it off so that it'll either hit the moon or hit Mars in little small chunks, nothing that would like blow up the planet, right?
Right.
And then we set up bases on both to process the materials. And then we leave the excess on both planets to help increase the gravity of both the moon and Mars. Obviously, the moon would have a limit. It's currently drifting off into space anyway, so it could bear to have a little bit more mass. And then Mars, we just keep loading that one up until it has good enough mass to hold an atmosphere. And then we can terraform it. There you go.
There's the responsibility thing too on the other side of that. Like, well, first of all, there's a method to that called ice dropping, I think is what they call it, or ice crashing, where you take ice asteroids and throw them at Mars until it's got enough water to sustain.
Well, yeah, for that. I'm concerned only about mass because I keep running into the problem where, yeah, we create an atmosphere. It's only going to hold on to it for so long because it doesn't have the mass. Mm-hmm. So we need to increase the mass of Mars, which would also increase the gravity and hopefully maybe kickstart some geological activity.
Yeah, we need more pressure on the core.
Right, more pressure. Maybe we leave some nickel unprocessed, and then have some radioactive material there, because part of the reason our core stays so hot is it's also radioactive.
Well, the thing is, you have to look at it from the point of view of long range thought process. And this is kind of one of those things where it's like harder to comprehend, but our planets are all still cooling down. And it's just taking forever to do it.
And the reason ours is so hot, though, is because it is actual. We have a lot of radioactive materials in ours, so it's
radioactive material does
giving.
add to it,
Mhm.
but there will come a time where even Venus and Earth their cores will go cold
Mhm.
because we're radiating all that heat out still,
Right.
and so we're losing energy. Even the radio active materials are bleeding off their energy.
Right.
So there comes a point where we cool to a stop. The
Mhm.
smaller planets, Mercury, Mars, have already cooled to a stop.
Mhm.
Or Mars is at the end of cooling to a stop. But Mercury is absolutely cooled to a stop. The moon has cooled to a stop.
Right.
So there's a certain amount of mass where. So I guess part of what I'm saying is, though it is a good idea to continue to add mass to Mars, it is kind of like adding dough to your bread in hopes to warm it back up.
Mhm.
It will work, but it's not going to work in the method that we think.
Yeah.
It's not going to work as easily as just throwing some rocks at it until it gets
Mhm.
to a mass where the core warms back up, because it bled the energy out.
Right.
You have to put the energy back in. It's a
Mhm.
thermodynamics law.
Yeah.
So we'd have to somehow pour that back into the system.
Mhm.
It's one of the reasons why the system of Bellatrix is different than ours. It still has a planetary disk, protoplanetary disk, right around the star, because Bellatrix is actually really freaking young. It's much younger than Sol as far as a star goes.
Mhm.
So it's still got two planets that are forming in a protoplanetary disk in the center. But all of the planets are warm core
Mhm.
because they're younger. So even Renum, which is a moon around the Jovian world, even that has a warm core. Brian just wants to throw rocks at the. I'll throw rocks at the problem. That'll end it.
That was the other metal. I remember nickel, iron was the main composite of our core, with some radioactive material.
Yeah, iron takes a long time to bleed off its heat.
Mhm.
I mean, we know that from just smelting tools.
Right.
It takes you really have to quelch iron to get it down to a reasonable temperature quickly, or iron will just sit there and bleed its heat off for days.
Mhm.
Um, so I mean, like, that's why our core is, like Brent's saying, will last longer. It won't last longer per se. It's just taking longer to cool down. Um, Whereas the core of Mars is heavier metals, but so that's the thing that's interesting is these are all flaws. Planets are flaws of the stars.
Mhm.
Um, every time you have a generation of stars, it gets dirtier every time it dies. So we're third generation stars here. The first generation stars have no planets at all.
Yeah.
The second generation stars only have high level planets, like they'll have Jovians, but that's it. Um, these the third generation stars have gotten so dirty that we're the pearls in the system. We're
Mhm.
pearls generated by the star's wreckage, the wreckage of it's all the crap that's gotten caught up in the mulling process of stars. So these concrete takes a long time to cool too. It's actually one of the problems we're having with changing the atmosphere is the amount of concrete, because that emits a ton of CO2 and it takes forever to cool and it's a mess. So changing the environment, all the concrete we're using, um, stuff like that. So it's fascinating. It is 11 o'clock.
Yep.
Noticing. I have noticed it's 11. Bill, I have really thoroughly enjoyed your birthday. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I mean, I'm glad you were able to sit here for a couple of hours with me
Yeah.
and talk through things. I have some amazing things I have written on this. the sheet. I mean, like, do you care? I think that's like such an amazing concept.
Yeah.
That in and of itself. Because I mean, one could argue, thinking just like, does George care?
Mhm.
Would George care? If George was aware that George was dying, would he care? You know, like
Mhm.
that's the sapience line.
Mhm.
You know, do you care? I mean, I understand fear. I know that the tiger is going to eat me, but that's not the problem.
Mhm.
The problem is I will die in X number of years. I catch a disease. I will die in 1 year. I care.
Mhm.
The disease isn't chasing me,
Yeah.
you know. That's the sapience line. Would George care if I just disappeared? He wouldn't have anybody to scratch his head. I just poof gone. So thank you very much for talking with me, Bill,
You're welcome.
and discussing all of these things. We should do this more often because I think this is. I have two things up here on the notes. Part of our distinction is our flaws as part of DNA manipulation and do you
Mhm.
care, which is defining sapient life forms. So we got like a couple of really fascinating things in here. Also, um, the silicate
Yeah.
names for the people, silicates. I think that's a good name. Sorry, Ray. There's like a whole day of messages from Bill.
If you're moving your show to the evening, I might be able to join. So.
Yeah, well, that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be moving it to 10 to midnight though, because my wife has asked not to start at 9.
Mhm.
She wants to at least have the ability to put the kid to bed and brush her teeth and get ready for bed herself.
Mhm.
And since her sink is right here, it's like you can hear her brushing her teeth. You know, and it's like she's like, I don't necessarily know if I. So we were actually thinking of putting up like a barrier. There's a opening right here which separates the bathroom section from. This is the master bedroom of our house, so it has its own bathroom.
Mhm.
Use that bathroom, my wife and I, and then my kid uses the bathroom. It's in the hallway.
Mhm.
That way, sort of makes you like high sills better. Um, so we were thinking of putting a barrier here, maybe just something simple like uh, a foldable screen, like a shoji screen. But yeah, some kind of barrier which would help. So
Will you still have a Friday show?
I will. I don't work on Fridays, so the school that I'm going to be doing will have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. They have 2 classes, a morning class and an afternoon class, and there are 8 classes. So it only runs till Thursday. And then Fridays I'll always have off. And Friday night I go and hang out with my buddy Troy. So we were talking about what probably will happen is I will probably still have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday will be night shows. Friday will be a day show, which I either will run live so that Ghost Hand and all of those guys can hang out with us, or I'll record and then play at night while I'm
Mhm.
at my buddies.
Yeah.
But it may just be a day show, and then everybody will just get used to it. Because then we could all still get together. But I was thinking of moving. Also, Pepper, this is aimed at you. I was thinking of moving artist check-in to Monday night so that we would be sort of doing a what are we doing this week, as opposed to what did we do this week. You know what I mean? Sort of more of a forward thinking than a backward thinking
Okay. No,
concept.
I can get behind that.
What?
I can get behind that.
Yeah, I figured. Yeah, I figured that would sound. It just sounds more logical.
Uh-huh.
And then Friday could be me doing Springs comics or whatever. We don't know what we're doing with Geek Tank because we were supposed to discuss it Monday, and then Troy had a problem show up, so he couldn't show up for the show. So it was just Alex and me. So we still don't know for sure what we're doing with Geek Tank. We'll figure that out. So anyway, okay. Well, I think we did awesome today on our show. I think we did great, and I think we had an amazing discussion. and I will save this show. I've been saving all the shows, but I've been like trying not to save every show because zillions of gigabytes of video. But I'm going to save this show because this is a fascinating discussion and all the stuff we talked about. Yeah, we got to figure it out this weekend. Well, I'm going to be at Troy's house Friday night, so I'll be able to figure that out. So, but anyway, thank you for joining me, Bill. Thank you, Brent and Ghost Hand, and gosh, Kat and Colton and Booma, and wow, we had a lot of people here today. We had who else was here for a moment? We had Aaron here for a minute, and then we had we had a lot of stuff. We had a lot of people. This was a great show. So thank you all for joining me, and I will see you all tomorrow. And as always, keep your eyes on the stars. Bye bye. Computer, good night.